We recently were at the World Championships in Barcelona, where there were several issues with people being disqualified. And I want to talk about and address one of those issues because I think it will be quite relevant to a lot of people in the community. So, one of the players who was disqualified during the draft for looking around. And, you know, you're not supposed to look around during a competitive draft in case you see some of the opponent's cards. He was. And I think, obviously, at a basic level, that's reasonably well known. But it is made quite interesting by the fact that that player has quite aggressive ADHD and was looking around the table kind of like as just a way of letting his brain work in the way that people with ADHD do. You know, he was twitching, moving in weird ways, you know, looking around, eyes twitching, that kind of thing. Now, I mean, obviously the outcome was that he impacted the integrity of the draft. He did see someone else's cards, which does impact the integrity of the draft, right? And you have to kind of acknowledge that really shouldn't happen. But it does bring up the conversation again that I've had previously. For those of you who don't know, so I have dyspraxia, which means my brain does not do movement things very well or consistently. And at Pro Tour Lille, I had a very long conversation with a judge who thought I was cheating in the called draft when I did not shuffle my cards consistently, and then glanced over towards my opponent after I had handed him 3 cards, and the judge said, you were trying to determine what card that opponent was taking, right? When, in fact, I just didn't shuffle 3 cards consistently because there are 3 cards there and my muscle memory is not great at doing that. And, of course, I was not looking at the cards he was trying to take. I didn't remember which of the cards was face down. I just glanced over to him because he was sitting right in front of me and he was moving his hands, and I just, you know, looked in that direction. Anyway, but the point is just that, you know, there is I would say, a decent number of people in this community whose brains do not work in the same way as other people's. And I think there's a very valuable discussion that's kind of brewing about how situations like call drafts are not particularly conducive to those people, you know, and really sort of providing allowances for how their brains work. And Fab needs to do something about this. And I think it stems to a broader issue of sort of like making allowances for medical conditions when and if it's sensible, right? And just bringing back to my own experience this weekend, I have an intolerance to a specific type of food, and I wasn't feeling particularly well because I had eaten it by accident. And I went to the judge before the calling draft, which is a time draft, and said, look, it's not going to happen. I've taken lots of pills, but I might have to get up in the middle of this draft quite urgently. If it happens, it'll happen once. But I'm obviously going to need to do that. And he told me his initial first response was, no, that's not possible. If you leave the table, you can't come back. And I said, look, I've got a medical problem. I'm telling you it's not going to be a problem, but I'm saying it might be. If I thought it would be a big problem, I would drop from the tournament, but I'm saying that it's not going to be, and I need you to take account of that. And his response was, no, it's not logistically possible. Right? So I'm coming to someone with a medical issue saying, hey, I've got this problem, and I'm immediately being rejected by the head judge of a tournament saying, no, we can't make allowances for that because it will disrupt 72 other people. And he said, do you expect me to disrupt 72 other people so that you can do this? And I said, yes, 100% I do. And I don't think that was an unreasonable ask. If I have to get the entire call draft to pause for 4 minutes because I'm having an episode with a medical condition in the middle of that draft, I will 100% do it. But that's not reasonable, which is why it is possible for a table after a delay or a disruption to run with a separate judge timing until they catch up to the rest of the event. And I reminded him of this, and he said, oh, okay, we can make that work. Not to worry about it, right? But I want to draw attention to the fact, because I think this is relevant for this whole discussion, that his initial response was no. And it was only after I pushed that I actually got the outcome that I wanted. And as, you know, a 33-year-old guy who's been living with conditions like this his entire life, it was easy for me to push because I've been told no in situations before, and I've had to say, actually, you're doing this for me and I'm going to make it happen, right? Now let's go back to this DQ, right? So this player is put into what is, for someone with ADHD, a very uncomfortable situation where they're forced to sit still, silent, looking face down at a table, listening to someone every 40 seconds. You're not really going to draft particularly slowly because, you know, you do everything fast because your brain works quite quickly. And then in between drafting, you're forced to sit perfectly silently still. That is not a conducive situation for someone with ADHD or any other kind, you know, plenty of other kinds of neuroatypical conditions. And then if you talk to the same player, you know, in another draft, he just tried focusing on one spot on the table. You know, hyperfixation is one of the tools that people who have, you know, ADHD and other conditions use to not, you know, outwardly display signs of their condition and to, you know, look or seem normal. And he felt more disconnected from the draft because he wasn't, you know, doing the stuff that his brain needs to do to stay focused. And he was just instead focusing and using his mental energy on not outwardly doing the things that his condition allowed to do. So we're getting to a point where really we're talking about a professional tournament which should be inclusive for everyone. And we're talking about reasonable accommodations that allow those people to participate in these events. And I think that's worth just taking a moment to think about as part of our reflection from Worlds and lessons we've learned from the World Championships. If you're the head judge at a tournament and someone with ADHD comes to you and says, look, I cannot take my hat off, I need to keep the hat on, it helps me focus, I can't think without it, I get distracted by the lights in the ceiling, do you allow that? If someone comes to you and says, look, I need this fidget toy or something underneath the table, I know I'm not going to use it to distract other people, it's not going to impact the draft, but I just need to be touching something, fidgeting with it during the tournament, even though there's a timed draft going on. What is your immediate response going to be? Are you going to say, no, that's not logistically possible? Are you going to say that's out of order? Are you going to say it's not going to work? Or are you going to consider what's being asked and ask yourself, is it reasonable? Right? I think that's where we come to from this discussion. If someone comes to you and says, hey, I have this problem, you know, because of how I am, how do we step into it? Now, obviously, there are asks and requests that are disruptive or that lend themselves to influencing the outcome of the tournament, right? For example, if that player had to be in a specific, you know, situation, they had to be in a certain seat or something like that, that would change the outcome of the tournament. But that is what happens for people with certain types of disabilities who can't move as easily or do not have the space as easily. So the second that someone gets someone, you know, someone in a wheelchair or someone with that kind of disability makes it into the top cut or the draft section of the World Championships, suddenly this question raises its head again. What's a reasonable allowance? I think, personally, myself, that, you know, obviously if someone is doing something that's going to disrupt the concentration of 100, 200, 300 other people, we get into the realms of this isn't a reasonable allowance and that person is going to have a hard time fitting into the tournament. But I think there is a whole ream of things before then that are possible and are easily doable. And what I'm saying through this video and what I think this discussion highlights is that we shouldn't get to a situation where someone with ADHD is in a situation where they want to fidget, they want to look around, and that leads to them getting disqualified because they saw something they shouldn't. We should be in a situation where people with ADHD are thinking, what do I need to get through this draft? And making it clear and asking for it before the draft starts, as long as it's reasonable. It doesn't disrupt someone if the fidgeting that someone's doing is with a sensory aid or a toy, you know, under the table. And if they know that they can ask for that in a comfortable situation and the judge will say yes before they end up in the top cut of a World Championships, you know, trying to draft and not finding their focus, right? Then we end up in a situation where these sorts of things are better and better solved. So that's my reflection following that disqualification. I think it's just important to acknowledge that. And I think it's important for you, if you're listening to this and this resonates with you, I am a player who finds it very, very hard to, sit still. I would like my fidget spinner or something like that at the tournament. And I think that will improve the quality of my drafting. Then I think that's worth starting a discussion. Try it at your local ProQuest, talk to your local judge, see if it actually helps. And if it does, think about bringing that with you to a Pro Tour or something like that, and thinking that you can ask the same there. There's a whole realm of reasonable discussions that can happen about what is happening with your condition and how that impacts the day that's going on. And ultimately, if the disruption that happens is minimal to other players and doesn't impact the integrity of the tournament, then that's a discussion that you should feel like you can have. Because ultimately, we're playing card games. It's not life or death. And you shouldn't have to suffer to get through something rigid like a core draft if your brain is screaming at you the entire time. And you may just find that you're better at it than you thought you were, because, you've always been basically working with a handicap or a penalty of being forced to sit still during that kind of event. So that's just something to think about. 1DQ at Worlds sparked a bit of a discussion, but I've obviously had my own experiences that lead me to think about this and talk about this a bit more. Though mine aren't obviously lining up exactly with ADHD and things like that, and I don't exactly know what those brains work and how they feel. But, I have my own forms of neuroatypicality, and they influence my views on these kind of things. So just something to think about, and I'll speak to you all soon.